Uh, Let me start from the beginning. I was the release manager for Ethereum. So I led the project through the launch process, wrote a lot of the initial documentation that told people what Ethereum was, and now I run an outfit called Hexair Capital, which is basically investing in all the areas where these kind of new platform technologies intersect with each other. But before that, I was an energy policy guy. So I worked for many years for Amy Real Evans at the Rocky Mountain Institute, edited two books which are quite well known. One is called Small is Profitable, and the other is called Winning the Oil Endgame. So there was a point back then where I knew basically everything there was to know about energy policy. And it's from that lens I'm going to examine this Internet of Things thing. So does anybody have a single, coherent, short explanation for why we need the Internet of Things? I'll give you a one-sentence shout. Somebody? Nobody feeling brave? Go on.
To digitize the real world.
Digitize the real world? Yeah, not bad. How's about this, right? Because the electricity grid is garbage, right? The electricity grid is a big, complicated, flaky thing. It doesn't really work very well, and it requires enormous amounts of capital investment to make the thing continue to function. And it's going into a period of massive turbulence because renewable energy changes the way that we put energy into the grid, it changes the core functions of the grid, and we have very little capital left for reinvesting in the grid. The golden age of huge municipal public works seems to be behind us for the time being, so we don't necessarily have the ability to upgrade what it is that we've created, because we were much more relatively wealthy than we are now when we originally built the national grid. It's a project of the 50s, 60s, 70s when we were a very, very rich nation compared to the rest of the world. Now we are on a much tighter budget, and we have to be efficient. And this is true everywhere. It's true for the Americans, it's true for the Germans. Everybody is poorer than they were when they set their national grids up. So if we want to be able to fully integrate renewable energy into the existing grid setups that we have, we can't have all of the devices on the grid be dumb and selfish, right? There's this famous parable in the UK about every time you would get to the end of a series of Doctor Who, 13 million people would simultaneously put their kettles on to have a cup of tea, and for this we have hollowed out mountains in Wales which run turbines, right? And that stuff is actually accurate to a degree. It's not quite as accurate as the parable is usually told, but it's roughly true. Mass consumer behaviour generates enormous demand spikes. Providing the capacity to handle those demand spikes costs you an enormous percentage of your total grid capacity for resources that are only used a few days a year. And the purpose of IoT is to basically make the electrical grid fly by wire, so that when the grid is busy, you can use some combination of fiat and market to slow down electricity demand within the parameters that you have. You can round off the peaks to give your spinning demand some time to come up. Sorry, not spinning reserve. You can basically take the load off your spinning reserve and give your gas plants time to come up. It generally just makes it vastly easier to manage the electrical grid when you can ask the grid to moderate its supply a little bit. And this is the fundamental reason for Internet of Things. All of the rest of the kind of home appliance crap, which I have a fair amount of, we went out and we did the experiment, we set up the house of the future, and it turns out to be kind of neat. But all of that stuff is basically just consumer nonsense, right? It's the latest thing which will sell, it has no fundamental value, and it's not really worth any more than transistor radios were 30 years ago. It's a tiny little incidental market. Even if people buy it, it's just coming out of consumer goods spending, and it has no fundamental importance. The fundamental importance is being able to do demand-side regulation of energy consumption in an on-demand way, because that's what gets you into the infrastructural spending, and it's what makes you a part of critical national infrastructure rather than being consumer nonsense. Now, the economics that produce consumer goods do not permit real security to be deployed, right? If you're buying a thing at Tesco for £9.99 on a shelf, you can almost guarantee that it will not have had proper cybersecurity done to it. Right? There's just no business model that allows that degree of analysis and security to be deployed on things which are being bought and sold out of the consumer retail market. It's just not a thing that's going to happen. So what you need in that kind of instance is a different business model which fundamentally pays for the security on the object. Exhibit A, the cell phone, right? Has anybody heard of people having a whole bunch of money stolen off their cell phone because somebody hacked their SIM? Does that ever actually happen? Even if your phone is stolen, in most cases, you will not lose value because somebody has compromised the stuff on your phone and taken phone minutes away from you and used them to call somebody else. right? Because the phone industry needed that stuff to be secure, because if it was hacked, there wasn't going to be a phone industry, phones are remarkably secure. You know, the SIM card is a cryptographic key pair in a relatively tamper-resistant little box that is the backbone of, frankly, half of civilization. If the mobile phone network fell over because you couldn't bill for it, you know, there would be enormous social disruption. And phones, and particularly the SIM cards, are built like critical infrastructure. They're built to a standard where you can reliably put them into a critical environment, and they will behave even when they are under constant attack from people that would like to make free phone calls. Does this make sense so far? So this is why we're going to talk about blockchain in the context of Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is not an internet of fancy little consumer products. Right? The Internet of Things is an extension of the national grid into damn near every object in your house, so that it's possible to steer and control the national grid to manage the shared infrastructure of the entire country's electricity generation and distribution networks. It's bringing national grid and the concerns that go with the national grid right into your living room, to the point where we can basically turn off things off as a way of protecting things like spinning reserve. Now, in that context, we then say, well, how do you get a sufficiently high threshold of security for these devices? And the answer is, you put the payment in the device. Right? The reason the SIM card is extremely secure is because the SIM card is money. If the SIM card is hacked, the phone company loses money, and the phone company doesn't want to lose money, so they actually make the damn thing secure. And the rationale for the necessary business incentives to produce properly secure end-use devices is that if the device is hacked, the vendor of the device has to lose value. If we don't have a system like that, we will not have a secure Internet of Things. What we will have is a 64 billion node botnet that's giving everybody orders about what they're going to do with their shoes, or it's going to charge them Bitcoin, right? And this kind of scenario, this is not so unrealistic, right? I mean, I was online, you know, not that long after the first computer worm was discovered, before we realized that self-replicating code that jumped from machine to machine to machine was a real thing. There was a kind of utopian phase where everybody thought the internet was just this kind of pure environment. And then some kid, I think Robert Morris maybe, figured out how to make a worm that would jump from machine to machine to machine and infected something crazy like a quarter of the internet in maybe 1989 or something. This is all ancient history. But the idea that you could have this Internet of Things rolled out on the presumption that everything was safe, and then have a botnet that was literally the biggest computer in the world by a factor of 50 running on everybody's IoT toasters, that's actually quite realistic. And you kind of build up a body of vulnerable devices, and once that body of vulnerable devices reaches a critical mass, it becomes such an appealing target that it becomes inevitable that somebody will knock it over. And if you're lucky, that's annoying teenagers or maybe even criminals. If you're unlucky, it's a state actor who's just turned off your country. And that's a very realistic thing. When people talk about cyber war, they're not kidding around, right? Department of Defense has been very, very long on cyber war for decades. And the ability to very, very quickly level another country without having to break a single building or kill a single person is extremely attractive in a defense context, because it's a capability that you could use, right? You might not want to do economic sanctions, you might not want to bomb somebody, you might not want to kill somebody, but if you can just turn off their country, that's a really attractive option. An Internet of Things, right? The price of having this fly-by-wire grid in which you've got the ability to control end-use devices dynamically is that you have the ability for somebody else to turn off those end-use devices dynamically, and now you really are in a lot of trouble. So the idea that what we're doing is basically extending critical national infrastructure level protection to the end-use devices, and that those end-use devices have to be secured because collectively they have the same security profile as something like a nuclear power station, is really important. Right? And this is not so much of an issue in the UK, because in the UK freezing to death takes a relatively large amount of effort. But imagine what happens if you turn off all the heating systems in, say, Boston or Minneapolis in the middle of winter. You wind up with a huge, huge, huge problem, like actual terrorism has occurred. Now, into this scenario we then put the blockchain, right? What are the basic attributes of the blockchain that make it relevant for this use case? Incredibly secure, small pieces of code that handle money. And this is smart contracts, right? You have little bits of code that tell your thermostat at what price it will buy energy and at what price it will sell. You put those policies into something that has a little clock that tells it what time it is, and you stick it directly onto the front end of your household system. And it just sits there, and once in a while it turns your heating off and you don't really notice. Oh, it's all chilly in here. I wonder what's happening. Oh, the thermostat is off. Okay. And you poke it and you turn it back on and it stops selling back to the grid, and off you go. But because it's on a blockchain, and because the blockchains, when correctly implemented, really are extremely secure, right? The entire value of Bitcoin, $25 billion or so, is a bounty on somebody being able to hack Bitcoin. The $9 or $10 billion that Ethereum is worth, it's a bounty on somebody being able to hack Ethereum. Those bounties indicate that these systems can be secured. If somebody hacks Bitcoin, they walk out with hundreds of millions of dollars minimally. So we're fairly sure these things are tight. They're in the field, they're being attacked continually, nobody has managed to get massive undue advantage. You could imagine that if you have these large-scale decentralized networks, attaching devices to the edge of those networks so that the security of the Bitcoin blockchain, the security of the Ethereum blockchain, the security of some other blockchain actually protects those end-use devices, is a reasonable model for how you would proceed to extend the critical national infrastructure from maybe 100,000 nodes as it stands at the moment to tens or hundreds of millions of nodes. Now, this is a fairly fundamentalist model, right? I'm quite fundamentalist on energy, I'm quite fundamental on national security. I think that energy and national security are inexorably linked. And a lot of my work 15 years ago was very much in that space. My more recent work is on blockchains. Blockchains were not custom designed for running the Internet of Things, right? You're going to have to do enormous amounts of adaptation and tinkering, or you're going to have blockchains which are specific to IoT. 15 blockchains, one per company, is a millionth as secure as one really big blockchain. You might want to think about that as a standardization effort, because if you wind up where you have one brand per blockchain, there's just no point. You might as well just use digital signatures. There is an enormous amount of thinking to be done about how you hash together all of this Internet of Things thinking, all of this blockchain thinking inside of the framework, which is energy security. Now, the last thing is the Internet of Agreements. This is a brave thing to say for somebody in my position. Blockchain is a passing fad, right? The thing that we currently call the blockchain is a set of prototypes that got wildly out of control, and they're absolutely fantastic, but they're prototypes. Bitcoin does less than 10 transactions a second, Ethereum does less than 30 transactions a second. These things are tinker toys, right? And if you yank out all the mining code and put something on the front end which is fast and turn it into a distributed ledger, your security is down to 30 machines, which could be compromised individually and then will write garbage to your blockchain. So if you want the security profile of a blockchain, you're going to need mining. If you're going back to a permissioned ledger, your security model is only as good as the security on 30 or so nodes. And that's a small enough number that you can see physical intrusion on those devices, right? There is not an easy way forward here. The thing which is coming over the horizon is what we call scaled blockchain. And scaled blockchain really, when you get right down to it, means parallel heterogeneous computing surface. Parallel heterogeneous computing surface, right? You wind up with all of the computers in the world which aren't currently busy, connected together into an enormous whole, which is markets for computing, and the secure computing mechanism allows you to take code from somewhere else in the world, run it on your nodes, post the results, compare with the same code run on other nodes, and then claim payments using some kind of escrow architecture. And all of the work around proof of stake and scaled blockchain and all the rest of that converges on this idea that you just take all of the spare computing capacity in the world and you make it available using some kind of economic incentive in a single surface, which basically takes the cloud model and merges the cloud completely into the blockchain. And that converged thing, where you get something with the security profile of the blockchain and the performance characteristics of the cloud running in a network that includes all the Internet of Things devices, is the inevitable direction of travel for the world. That's what it looks like when we take the stuff that we've already got an enormous amount of investment in and we simply connect the pieces together into what people actually want to buy. Now, I don't know whether that's 5 years out or 10 years out. I don't know whether that's called Bitcoin++, Ethereum 2, or it comes directly out of left field. I have a personal gut feeling that you have to use functional programming to get there, and you probably need to go back to pi calculus and build the entire thing out from there. All of those are guesses and intuitions. So we have this thing we call the Internet of Agreements. And the Internet of Agreements is the human face of the evolving process that we call blockchain. Right? You don't really care for most reasons, as a consumer, how your computer security is rendered. You don't really mind how it's done. All you care about is that you get the stuff that you want to get done, and that your devices work when you push their buttons. Toaster, on. Hot water, on. What do you mean, no, right? You just want to avoid that. You don't care how it works. And all of this fanatical focus on the why has left, on the how has left us a little vague on the why. So the world that we want is a world in which human beings can make an agreement with each other, and the machines implement the agreement that the people have made. And that's what we're really driving toward. There is some element of natural language processing, there's some element of artificial intelligence, there's some element of smart contract. In the future, there could well be an element of robotic logistics and manufacturing. But at the end of the day, you want an end-to-end experience where human beings make an agreement about how something will be, and then it is that way, because the machines line up around the agreement that people have made, and then implement that agreement. Now, come back one more time, all the way back to the Internet of Things, right? The Internet of Things has a very big thing component. There's an awful lot of physical packages you go to Dixon's, you buy, and you bring home, and you take it home, you take it out of the box, and it magically joins its network, and then it behaves as a good citizen. You see it as the toaster, where your agreement with the toaster is I push the button and I get toast. The National Grid sees it as a device where my agreement with the toaster is it will give me 5 or 10 seconds of leeway before it starts cooking, just in case we're in the middle of a really serious grid crunch. So, to implement the Internet of Agreements thinking around a device like a smart toaster, for the consumer, they have to have an implicit contract with the toaster that the toaster will always obey. The contract between the toaster and the toaster's manufacturer and the manufacturer and the National Grid, that contract can be much more technical and much more Internet of Things flavoured. But we need to be aware that there are two levels of reality here. The customer who sees the Internet of Agreements, and that's simply the devices do what I think they should do because the contracts are implicit, and then the explicit back-end implementation where these devices are well-behaved first-class actors on the National Grid, which, when asked to, will turn off in a way that provides negawatts for grid utilities. And I could talk a bit more about the implementation details and how much energy you can save and how much it reduces the need for capital on the grid to operate the grid if you take these kind of measures. But the bottom line is, all of that stuff is written up in a book called Small is Profitable. It's about 10 years old at this point. 15? 15 years old, God, 2003. And it really gets into the nitty-gritty of this stuff. It is really pre-anything that you would recognize as being IoT as a model, because it's so prescient. But it really does give you a clear understanding of how the ability to control customer load affects the fundamental capital requirements of the grid. And then for the computer security side of this, you know, how much more seriously can we say it? We're talking about extending the National Grid to everybody's house. The security has to be near absolute. That's all I had to say. Thank you. Are we doing questions now, or?
We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Okay,
now.
great, fantastic.
So that was absolutely fascinating. Who wants to take issue with Vinay about blockchain as a passing fad, or any other aspects of what he's just said?
Roger Black Hamilton, DigiFreds.
Sorry, could you say your name?
Roger Black Hamilton, DigiFreds. Not so much a challenge on passing fad. Definitely there's a lot of hype, but the hype's good, I think, in innovation, because it gets things moving. I'm more interested in a concept of the consumer and the device, and then obviously the data which is created, and how do you see the individual, the consumer, taking much more control and ownership of the data which is created on his behalf, and then therefore seeing that as a value which can be resold.
Yeah, the data thing is really hard. Now, God, I don't want this to be a 5-minute response, so I'm going to have to try and compress. But the fundamental economic value of consumer data is that it allows you to streamline what's happening in the rest of society around what people actually do, rather than having the provision for everything they might do. So if I'm Tesco and I have a really good model of what people buy on a kind of store-by-store-by-store basis that includes a lot of insight into their lives, you know, I know your kids have a birthday and you're probably going to come and buy a cake, and there's probably going to be one there when you come, right? There is an enormous opportunity to optimize the fundamentals of the real economy using these kind of data sets. The problem is, who gets the benefit of that optimization? Does it go to me as the customer? Does it go to the company that has the data set? Or does it go to something like perhaps a national government? So I think there's actually a really reasonable argument that we could say that that kind of consumer data actually belongs to UK PLC in the same way the Ordnance Survey does, and we rely on the government to protect our interests in handling the collective data of the UK when it comes to consumer behaviour. Now, I'm not sure the UK would be the first country over that kind of wall, but I think it's just worth thinking, like, is this actually a national asset? Is it a personal asset? Does it belong to a company? There are a lot of potential right answers for that. But I think it is a political decision rather than being a business decision, because at the end of the day, privacy is a matter of law, and we shouldn't really be throwing this open to the market without having really thought about what the state has to say. But yeah, I mean, I did round of work for UCL Institute for Security and Resilience Studies on this. If you're interested in chasing it up, get in contact and I'll send you a link to the old documents.
Just a follow-up question on that. I mean, in relation to the general data protection regulation, the trend is more towards consumers having more control of their own data. Sorry, I don't know if everyone can hear me. I was just saying in regards to the GDPR that the trend, and also in the US with healthcare regulation, is the consumer will have more control over their own data rather than, so you're saying government would have control over that data. Doesn't blockchain actually enable a solution to that in the sense that we are much more able to see what data is being kept and for the individual to have access to that, as well as potentially giving permission to others to access the same data, whether for cash or for free use for public research?
Managing private information on blockchains is really hard. I mean, the blockchain is basically heavily about transparency. If you've got a blockchain that has this kind of translucent quality, there's an old book called Translucent Databases, which is worth a look through. It's pre-blockchain. But if you have that kind of translucency on it, do you wind up using something which is very sophisticated, like ZK snarks, so you've got partial, things like zero knowledge proofs, or do you wind up with encrypted compartments and some kind of key management system? At a kind of technical level, yeah, there's a lot of discussion about, yeah, we should use the blockchain for doing personal data storage, but practically it's quite slippery. I mean, for records of what has been done, the blockchain is really good, but for the actual facts, I'm not sure I want that stuff on the blockchain. So, I mean, yeah, I think this is a really, really complicated issue, and I don't have a clear opinion yet.
Hi, Sasha Meckler from Analysis Mason. So I think bringing up the point of the GDPR is actually an interesting one, because the key term in GDPR is actually the responsibility aspect. And the question I was going to ask was, particularly in an Internet of Agreements, is there not a sort of negative potential externality that's going to emerge out of this in terms of not ensuring that as systems become more distributed, that people at the same time take more responsibility for the activities and actions on those systems? Because if we divulge and we try to avoid that responsibility by allowing machines to execute on all of our wills and all of our agreements, we're actually creating a real monster.
Well, I mean, that monster was first born with credit cards, right? We've had to deal with people doing stupid stuff using the empowerments that technology gives them forever. But in a network setting, e-commerce, I don't know whether you're probably too young to remember, but the scare stories in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, about this new e-commerce thing made shopping so easy that people were blowing their life savings on whatever it was, catalog shopping, right? That kind of stuff. How do we protect people from themselves, right? Tobacco is still legal. People are still allowed to gamble on the high street. At what point do we step in and say, okay, we can't do this? On a blockchain, of course, the convention is that we have non-repudiatable payments. So once your payment is made, your payment is gone, and there's no mechanism for retrieving it. If we're going to have regular people using those systems, that's probably not going to be a stable equilibrium, because mistakes get made, right? There's a normal error rate when you give people access to any kind of tool. But I don't think you could have a blockchain with repudiatable payments and have any kind of fundamental security. I think you need consumer protection via insurance. So my suggestion would be that consumers carry insurance against accident, right? They could carry insurance against digital accident, and that in the event that somebody does something dumb, they claim on their own insurance in the same way that you would if you dropped some, your Ming vase.
So, I mean, maybe just as a quick follow-up.
I guess to me it was less about consumer protections and rather about leveraging the full sort of capability of what blockchain could achieve in terms of social good. So for example, if we use the national grid example, instead of people entering agreements with the national grid, why they could be doing it at a peer-to-peer level,
yes,
effectively fulfilling the role of national grid without there being some hegemon
Ah.
that needs to sit in there, and it's that kind of the removal of that responsibility threatens the value
Yeah.
and the human flourishing that could
Yeah.
arise out of something like this.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, now I understand exactly. This is an even more complicated question. So there's a lovely book by Robin Chase called Peers Inc. Robin is the one that started Zipcar. And Peers Inc. basically is an analysis of why sharing networks generally need some kind of central authority to manage a bunch of stuff. And there's no denying that blockchain will handle some part of that set of functions, but the thing that she points out as being the real requirement why you need something in the middle is regulatory interface. So the state requires something to talk to in order to figure out whether something is safe or unsafe. Inside of power networks, I am actually generally fairly negative about microgrids, but I'm very positive about negawatt utilities where you just turn off people's toasters. So I'm still not sure that the natural scale for optimizing electricity utilities is actually national or international. Unless you've got actual off-grid installations, but then 20 years from now, I think you could even see quite large towns being off-grid relative to the outside world, in which case you would need those kind of power markets internally. But yeah, this is very swampy because it's just so political, it's so much consumer behavior, it's so technology dependent, the blockchains are not ready to handle that kind of load yet. It's very, very wait and see from my perspective.
Any other questions? Maybe one more from you before we just move to the next speaker. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
going into that point, regulators obviously, they have a huge amount to get their heads around when it comes to these technologies. I mean, you've got blockchain and distributed ledgers, you've got Internet of Things, you've got convergence of different aspects of that. It's not easy to get your head around it. It's moving very, very quickly.
Yes.
Do you think enough is being done to sort of address that problem, and how do you think that regulators can kind of find their way through the weeds, if you like, of these issues? Because obviously there is consumer concern about data and about how that data is being used, and I'm not sure I'd like the idea of the government sort of taking all the data from all my appliances and using it, even if it was sort of, theoretically for the public good. It seems very kind of Big Brother-esque. So
Yeah.
how do they kind of get through that?
The Hexer Capital blog runs a medium that's called Humanizing the Singularity. And Rob and I gave it that as a somewhat humorous name. But that is sort of the challenge that we're looking at. We're not in an environment where rate of change is going down anytime soon. Right? The same kind of transformation that you saw with just the good old plain old internet was kind of one thing at a time. Then there was mobile, and mobile was sort of one thing at a time. Now, I think we're at 5 things at a time, right? We've got the whole self-driving thing and the drones and all the robot stuff. We've got the Internet of Things angle. We've got virtual reality. We've got augmented reality. We've got blockchain. We've got AI. So we have this multiple breakout thing happening simultaneously. And frankly, if I was staring at all of that from the perspective of somebody that was going to regulate, I would look at it as a tsunami. I mean, I just don't know how you cope with so much technological change so quickly. And government is, kind of the insurer of last resort, right? If something goes really dramatically wrong with technology and it really screws up, it's going to wind up with police or firemen or regulation or lawsuits, litigation. It's going to wind up with the state as a catcher when things go really wrong. So I think that there's an enormous challenge to government to actually figure out very proactive, very engaged, very humane ways of managing technology regulation, not just the regulation, but also kind of guidance to avoid trouble. We ought to be kind of in a mechanism where the government can say, look, and by the way, not necessarily the government, you could also have consumer unions doing this role, but large authoritative structures that are concerned with consumer protection ought to be able to say to technology companies, look, we've had a real think about this, and we think this technology is going to run a lot of people into trouble, and we're going to carry the cost of picking up that mess. Would you please not do that? Right? And I think we do this for consumer credit. In theory, we're sitting on the credit industry trying to get them not to offer products which are that bad for people. Yeah. In theory, we're doing it for gambling. In theory, we're doing it for things like tobacco, alcohol. We may need to accept that as these technologies become really widespread, protecting people becomes a much larger part of the technology landscape than it was when it tended to be educated elites with disposable incomes, who if they made a £500 error, they would recover.
Yeah.
right? If you're very poor, if you're on the dole and you make a £500 error using some piece of blockchain technology, you're in real trouble and you're going to be looking for emergency benefit payments. And that notion that we have to take a much more protective attitude because so many more people are using these technologies from a much wider range of society, that you need to extend more protection. I think that's going to be a challenge for all governments, not just in the UK.
Definitely.
It's a real ongoing struggle, and I think it's only going to get more intense year on year for at least the next decade.
Yeah,
It's going to be interesting times.
I used to work in think tank land, so I'm
Yeah.
sort of asking from that
That's it.
perspective.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you very much, Vinny.
Thank
That
you.
was fascinating.